On November 1st, 1984, North Carolina's Central Prison was quiet, but inside death row, time was running out for Velma Barfield. Just a few hours later, she would be executed, making her the first woman in the United States to face the death penalty in more than 20 years. Despite what was coming, Velma wasn't panicking. She wasn't restless. Instead, she was calm, eerily calm. Unlike most prisoners who spend their last night struggling to sleep, Velma lay on her cot, eyes closed, breathing steady. A prison guard assigned to watch her closely noticed this unusual composure. As the minutes passed, the silence felt heavier. Finally, he leaned in and asked softly, "Are you okay?" Velma barely stirred. Her response was simple, "Yes." Then, without hesitation, she rolled over and drifted back to sleep. The same woman who had poisoned her loved ones, who had taken lives without hesitation, was now at peace in her final hours. Was it acceptance? Was it faith? Or was it something else? In just a few hours, her name would be etched into history, not as a grandmother, not as a caregiver, but as a convicted murderer who had exhausted every appeal. The countdown had begun. For most of her life, Velma Barfield was seen as an ordinary woman. Born in 1932 in rural South Carolina, she grew up in a strict household, married young, and became a mother. To the outside world, she was a devoted wife and later, a loving grandmother. No one could have guessed that beneath this quiet, religious persona, a dark secret was lurking. Her crimes might have remained hidden if not for the death of her fiancé, Stuart Taylor. In 1978, Taylor fell mysteriously ill and died soon after. At first, his passing didn't raise suspicion, but when an autopsy revealed high levels of arsenic in his system, the truth began to unravel. Velma, the grieving fiancée, was suddenly the prime suspect. Investigators dug into her past, and what they found was horrifying. Stuart Taylor wasn't the first to die under suspicious circumstances. Velma's first husband, Thomas Burke, had also died suddenly, reportedly from natural causes. Years later, her second husband, Jennings Barfield, met a similar fate, but that wasn't all. Her own mother, Lillian Bullard, had fallen mysteriously ill, not once, but twice. The first time, she survived. The second time, she didn't. And then came the most chilling revelation. As a caregiver, Velma had been trusted with the lives of vulnerable elderly patients, but 3 of them had died under her watch. Each case had been dismissed as natural deaths until now. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Velma Barfield wasn't just unlucky. She wasn't just a grieving widow. She was a serial poisoner who had hidden behind the mask of a kind, church-going woman for years. By the time the evidence was undeniable, Velma had confessed. She blamed addiction to prescription drugs, claiming they clouded her judgment. But remorse or not, it didn't change the fact that she had left a trail of bodies behind her. And now time was running out. In just a few hours, she would no longer be able to rewrite her story. Her crimes had finally caught up with her. As the sun rose over Central Prison on November 1st, 1984, Velma Barfield woke up for the last time. Just a few hours remained before her execution. She sat up slowly, coughed lightly, and looked around her small cell. There was no panic in her eyes, no sign of fear. She called out to the guard outside her cell. "Could I get some hot water?" Moments later, a cup of instant coffee was placed in her hands. She wrapped her fingers around it, taking a slow sip. "I slept well," she murmured with a faint smile. "Must have been because I barely slept the night before." It was a strange thing to say. A person about to face execution joking about a good night's rest. But Velma was no ordinary prisoner. She reached for her Bible and began flipping through the pages. Over the past 6 years on death row, her faith had become her only comfort. She had been baptized again, dedicating herself to Christianity, ministering to fellow inmates, even praying for the prison guards. Her pleas for clemency had focused on this transformation. Her lawyers had argued that she wasn't the same woman who had poisoned her loved ones. They claimed her redemption should spare her life. But the law wasn't built on second chances. That morning, Governor Jim Hunt officially denied her final appeal. The decision was final. No more courtrooms, no more legal battles. At 9 a.m., the prison logbook noted her behavior. "Appears very calm, While others on death row had spent their final hours in terror, Velma continued on as if nothing had changed. As she removed her hair rollers and smoothed her graying curls, the countdown continued. Time was slipping away, and she knew it. By mid-morning, Velma Barfield prepared for her last set of visitors. Despite the circumstances, she remained composed, her demeanor unchanged. At 9:30 a.m., she was escorted down the hallway toward the visiting area. She walked steadily, her hands cuffed in front of her, acknowledging the guards with a small nod. As she entered the room, an unexpected moment of kindness unfolded. A correctional officer approached her, holding a small yellow flower. "This is from the men of Central Prison," he said softly, "a token of their respect for you." The guards hesitated, unsure if she should be allowed to take it. But when she reached out, no one stopped her. She held the flower gently and said, "Thank them for me." Just before 11:30 a.m., her pastor, Hugh Hoyle, arrived. Velma's face lit up with genuine joy, an odd contrast to the reality of the day. But Hoyle wasn't there to bring comfort. He was carrying devastating news. "Velma," he said gently, taking her hands, "your final appeal has been denied." For a brief moment, she looked away. Then, without hesitation, she turned back to him, unshaken. "Well," she said softly, "that's what I figured." Hoyle hesitated before asking one final question. "Is there anything at all, that's left unconfessed?" Velma held his gaze and shook her head. "No, brother, I'm ready to go." By 12 p.m., lunch was served: pea soup, crackers, and fruit punch. She ate quietly, flipping through a fresh stack of letters and telegrams. Messages of support, prayers from strangers, and final words from those who believed in her redemption. When the chaplain asked if she was all right, she simply said, "Don't worry about me. Look after the other inmates. They need you more." The afternoon brought more visitors. Her brothers, Jimmy and John, came to see her, along with a cousin. Their conversations were light, avoiding the inevitable. But the most emotional meeting was yet to come. At 5 p.m., the doors opened for Velma's final visitors, her children, Ronnie and Pam. While others were limited to 30-minute visits, 2 full hours had been reserved for them. The moment Pam saw her mother, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. She clung to Velma, her cries filling the room. Ronnie stood nearby, struggling to find the right words, his grief held just below the surface. But Velma, even in these final moments, wasn't focused on her death. She took Ronnie's hand and gave him final instructions. "Take care of Pam," she told him firmly. "Handle the funeral arrangements. And no matter what happens, remember the good times." The minutes passed too quickly. When the guards announced that time was up, Pam refused to let go. She held on tightly, desperate for just a little more time. That it was Ronnie, despite his own grief, who gently pulled her away. "Come on," he whispered. "We have to go." As they walked toward the door, he told Pam, "Don't look back." But she did. And that final image, her mother, sitting there in her last hours, would stay with her forever. As the evening stretched on, Velma Barfield sat alone in her cell. The emotions she had kept under control throughout the day finally surfaced. She wiped away silent tears, knowing the goodbyes were over. Now all that remained was the inevitable. At 6:13 p.m., she placed a small request: cheese doodles and a Coke. When they arrived nearly 30 minutes late, she didn't complain. Instead, she set them aside and reached for a pen and 2 small white Bibles. Her fingers, dusted with orange from the untouched snack, carefully wrote final messages inside each Bible. They weren't for herself. They were for others, parting gifts to the few who had stood by her. At 7:15 p.m., the guards arrived at her cell door. It was time for her last meeting with her lawyers. As she stepped out, her wrists were bound in handcuffs. In the hallway, 2 familiar faces waited, her attorneys, each holding a single red rose. Richard Burr, one of her lawyers, fought to keep his voice steady. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. Velma looked at him with surprising warmth. "You did everything you could," she reassured him. "Thank you." The 3 spent over an hour together, talking, reflecting, not about legal battles but about shared humanity. When the guards returned, the lawyers knew there was nothing left to say. At 11:30 p.m., Chaplain Phil Carter entered her cell. He was visibly uneasy, unsure if he could provide the comfort she needed. But Velma wasn't thinking about herself. Instead, she asked about her children, her family, the warden, the execution team, even the very people preparing to take her life. That's all she talked about, the chaplain would later recall. At 1:45 a.m., the final preparations began. Velma changed into pink pajamas, a small request that had been granted. A diaper was secured, a grim but necessary procedure. A heart monitor was taped to her chest. Then, the guard strapped her arms and legs onto the gurney and inserted 4 lines into her veins. A slow drip of saline began to flow. Beyond the thick glass window, silent witnesses watched. Some had come for justice, others had come for closure. As she lay there, the warden stepped forward and asked, "Do you have any final words?" Velma's voice remained steady. "I want to say that I am sorry for all the hurt that I have caused. I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain. To all the families connected, I am sorry. I want to thank everybody who has supported me all these years." At 2:15 a.m., the warden gave the final signal. 3 syringes were attached to the 4 lines, each controlled by a different executioner. Only 2 contained lethal chemicals. 1 was a placebo, ensuring that no single person would know if they had administered the fatal dose. The chemicals flowed. Velma took a deep breath. Her eyes fluttered. Her breathing slowed. At 2:25 a.m., Velma Barfield was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, demonstrators stood divided. Some held signs that read "Justice served." Others carried messages of mercy, believing she had redeemed herself too late. Inside, her Bible remained on the small table in her cell, its pages worn from years of use. It was the only thing she left behind. By 2:30 a.m., Velma Barfield's body was removed from the execution chamber. The cold, clinical process continued as prison staff followed standard procedures. Her body was placed on a stretcher, covered with a white sheet, and wheeled through the quiet corridors of Central Prison. Outside, a waiting ambulance idled under the dim prison lights. Within minutes, she was driven away, leaving behind the walls where she had spent the last 6 years of her life. News of her execution spread quickly. Reporters, who had gathered outside the prison for hours, rushed to file their stories. Headlines the next morning would read, "Velma Barfield executed, first woman put to death in 22 years. Reactions were mixed. For some, justice had been served. They saw her execution as the only appropriate punishment for the lives she had taken. But for others, it was a tragedy. A woman who had found faith, sought redemption, yet was denied mercy. Her children, Ronnie and Pam, had witnessed their mother's final moments. They left the prison devastated, carrying the weight of a reality they had hoped to avoid. Pam, who had begged for clemency until the very end, struggled the most. No matter what crimes Velma had committed, she was still her mother. The debate over her execution lasted far beyond that night. Some believed Velma's religious transformation should have spared her life, arguing that she had changed. Others saw her newfound faith as a convenient excuse, a desperate attempt to avoid punishment. What was undeniable, however, was the fact that her victims never got a second chance. The people she poisoned had no opportunity for redemption, no appeals, no last words. Velma Barfield's funeral was held quietly and attended by close family and a few supporters. She was buried in a small cemetery in North Carolina, far from the prison where she had spent her final years. Her case remains one of the most debated executions in U.S. history. It forces one lingering question. If someone truly repents for their crimes, should they still face the ultimate punishment? What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more in-depth true crime stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications.